Hello, my name is Shephard, and today I will be talking about case study rebuttal for student group 8, biology of the organisms and or process involved in the case that they chose, which was the forensic botany and the recovery of charged vegetal specimens. Let's begin with just the general background of student group 8's case study. So this was a case that occurred in Gorizia, Italy. The victim disappeared 20 months prior to the discovery of their body, coincidentally being around the time frame the victim had been evicted from their home. The victim was found in a plastic sack containing their skeletal remains and a bunch of other vegetal substances such as timber that happened to be charred and a bunch of other botanical specimens. This sack was found within a hydroelectric power station's tank, and the only way the victim was able to be identified was through DNA analysis. This plastic sack had a wide range of burnt timber, which we will speak about in the next slide. Moving on to speaking about the various types of botanical vegetal specimens that were found in the sack with the human skeletal remains are the Aleppo pine, the cluster pine, the stone pine, spruce, Philadelphus, and Staphylia type of timbers that were all found. The Aleppo pine is mostly used for its fine timber and are found in the Morocco, eastern Spain areas, whereas cluster pine is as well also used for its timber, found in Morocco as well, and stone pine, however, is rarer in the Morocco area but is found in the southwest Europe areas, whereas spruce and the others are normally planted whenever in need, I guess you can say. They're more of a type of nursery type of plant. So like if shade trees type of thing, that's where you can go and plant those, but they're not normally found throughout Europe as the other pines are. Lastly, we are going to move on to the specifics on the case and why were these specific trees so important to this case. So, knowing the botanical background of these specific trees helps create an environmental scene of where the crime could have occurred and where the body was placed prior to the plastic sack being found in this hydroelectric tank. The specific vegetal specimens found in the plastic sack are commonly found throughout moist or cooler environments in Europe, causing a wide range of possible crime scene locations that this could have occurred. The reason why there was such a gap in finding exactly what happened was at first there was no specific determination of what specific trees were in that sack. It was kind of just like, well, this is what is similar to what it looks like, but there was no specific determination. If there was a specific determination of what tree was in that sack, for instance, spruce versus the pine trees, it could have helped determine less of a wide-ranged area where this crime could have occurred. For example, at the victim's house, there were only spruce trees that were vegetating around there. So if there was spruce, charred spruce trees in that sack with the victim, then it could have been known that maybe this victim was murdered at their house because the spruce is in there with them. However, during the field research of investigations at the power station contained only pine. So if there was pine located in this sack, then it could have been determined, okay, the crime could have happened at the power station, causing a more specific investigation of where this crime could have occurred. The specifics could have given a better set location as to where this crime occurred and could have helped achieve so many different levels on the criminal justice side to help find where this victim had been killed.
Hello, so we're going to be discussing case 7 in rebuttal, in which forensic botany in the recovery of charred vegetal specimens was found. So in November 2012, a plastic sack that contained male remains of a human male was found in the tanks of a hydro electric power station in Italy. So now in the sack there was the charred bone fragments of the male, which they were not able to find DNA for. And then they also had botanical elements such as charred pieces of wood and burnt timber, as well as some charred branches that were, attributable to 2 different broadleaf trees. So in their investigation, it did not fully determine whether it was the Mediterranean pine or spruce that was found within the sack. They saw at the victim's house that a column of smoke was seen rising from the courtyard, which is why they invited a forensic botanist to examine the charred fragments within the sack, as well as the plants that were found within the front yard of the victim. Because it was not determined whether it was Mediterranean pine or spruce within the victim's home or within the sack, one can argue that if Mediterranean pine if it was further analyzed and Mediterranean pine was determined to be the charred fragment within the sack, but the victim only had spruce within his front yard, it can be found that that charred fragment did not come from the same location as the spruce that's located within the victim's yard. So if you look at, they could have done further investigation, such as looking at the medullary rays and which are these vascular cells that transport nutrients, or they could have looked at the resin channels, which are these long elongated structures that surround these epithelial cells. Another thing they would have looked at is whether they had a secondary medullary ray or just a primary medullary ray, which will determine the age of these structures. But since they did not do that, one can say that, the evidence did not come from the same location as the known evidence. During the analysis, they used a compound microscope to analyze further these charred pieces of timber or wood. An issue with compound microscope is resolution, which is very important when you're analyzing cells. So they use 400 times magnification, and the higher resolution that you use, the higher the magnification, the lower the resolution. So if you look at the photo on the top, you can actually see that there are some rectangular epithelial cells within this piece of charred fragment. But when you look at the image on the bottom, that resolution is so poor that you cannot actually tell the shape of these cells. Therefore, one could argue that you cannot compare these two. And they say that these looked very similar, but the resolution is so poor you cannot tell if they look similar or not. So one can say that this piece of charred wood did not come from the same piece of charred wood found in the victim's home. Another thing to note is they were comparing charred pieces of botanical evidence to uncharred pieces, and as wood is heated, or as it if it's on fire or it's burnt, that structure begins to change. So it becomes very unreliable to compare a healthy piece of wood to a charred piece of wood whose structure has already begun to make transitions or changes. Lastly, they talked about charred branches and broadleaf trees. These are the two types of trees that they found. It could be either or found within the sack and at the victim's home. But they did not do further investigation, like further investigation or analysis of these trees was not discussed. So it's unreliable to say that it was either or tree because they did not discuss the type of analysis that was performed, or whether the charred fragments found within the sack were the same as the trees found within the victim's home. Thank you.
Forensic botany and the recovery of charred vegetal specimens, rebuttal. In November 2012, a plastic bag containing human skeleton remains from a male person was discovered in one of the tanks of a hydroelectric power plant in northern Italian region of Gorizia. The victim was recognized by DNA analysis, and it was discovered that he was a missing person who had gone missing roughly 20 months before. This was around the time that his landlord had evicted him. The plastic bag included many charred bone fragments and several botanical materials, including bits of charred wood with some of the partly burned lumber resembling either a Mediterranean pine or a Mediterranean cypress. A botanical comparison was performed between the burnt vegetal specimens discovered in the bag and the plant species growing in the courtyard. The macroscopic properties of the pine wood fragments associated with bone fragments, such as their annular amplitudes and carbonization state, as well as the microscopic diagnostic elements such as the medullary rays and resin channels, all appear to be the same and nearly perfectly coincided with those sampled in the courtyard shown in the following slide. When botanical specimens are deteriorated and lack physical qualities, many plant materials cannot be recognized and discriminated to species level using traditional morphological characteristics. Two chloroplast DNA sections were examined for their use as barcoding markers for plant identification in the area of forensics using the universal barcode system. DNA sequencing and other biomolecular methods used commonly in forensic investigations. These are my references.
This is case study rebuttal number 1. In this case study, there was a reasonable understanding of the case and evidence used, yet there was missed opportunity within the presentation. First, while a lot of the information provided, it did give us information about the case. That's all it did, though, as a summary. My concern is what was presented. How does that roll into or tie into the botany of it, where because of forensic botany, this case was able to connect an ID with the suspect. Here what was presented. Here's more direct. This provides the presentation of a quick to the point overall image of the case and making the statement that forensic botany made this possible to being able to assist in DNA analysis. Next, the presentation of evidence was very informative, which for those who are new to this would prove to be informative reading material. My concern here is the missing answer of where and how did the elements in botany come into play in this case. The mention of the habitat here would be if one was sightseeing more, but we need to ask where the significance of those items being tied to in the case. So recall the last question on the previous slide. Now think of the case. We have items found in the sack, Mediterranean pie, as well as charred branches. These items trigger the need to have a botanist involved. The areas these items are located produce 3 possible areas that will need to be investigated. So we know opportunity with the soil and items found in the sack gave the case 3 possible areas to investigate. Here we can lay out the botany of it for the audience about the case. Your audience should be wanting to know how will tiny pieces and burned bone do anything for investigators that will help with the results. Reviewing and presenting a case study, you are the reviewer as well as the presenter and the spectator in the crowd. So here's an example of a target answer to the initial question I asked at the beginning of the presentation. And it's to APA reference. We always want to follow APA guide and always list in alphabetical order. And as my end evaluation, it's uncertain and unreasonable linkages were established between the case's science and the technique's limitations. There was no thought given to the wider use of forensic botany in this case. Rather, it demonstrated more of an artificial understanding of the case with not so much the forensic science of it with botany, as it should have been explaining in its methods and importance when less common scenarios like this occur and require a botanist to be involved. That concludes, and thank you.